Did you know that I've been doing this gig since the end of 2010? Strange to think about, since the world was so much different 10 years ago and I was a different person when I was 15, and the gaming climate a decade ago? Well, that was practically unrecognizable compared to what we're dealing with now. If you think the kind of games that have come out in that time period and how they've progressed in a direction that hopefully doesn't exploit the consumer too much in the future, it's kind of wild to think about, isn't it? Gonna need some sticky shoes if we start sliding down that particularly slippery slope. At this point in the year, everyone's made their videos about the best and the worst games of the decade, and I have to too, because I played many games in that period of time, and I have opinions on most of them. However, I'm not going to be talking about the worst games of the decade, because after a while, you see all those bad games together, they kind of just form into a pile of brownish, greyish goo. There's only so many ways of saying a game is bad. Plus, this way I can focus my energy on some of the incredible games that came out in the 2010s, rather than reserve some to talk about other people's mistakes. It doesn't take much energy at all to realise that this particular undertaking is a lot of effort, since there's been slightly more than 10 good games released in the last 10 years, and somehow narrowing it down to just a handful is not something that I'm going to live down. Seriously, I've looked over my list and all that I'm doing is noticing the big names missing from it and struggling to squeeze every game into this video. I'm going to be making enemies, I'm going to have to change the locks on my house. So take what I say in the next 15 to 20 minutes with a grain of salt, because this video has had some of the hardest decisions I've ever had to make on this channel. It's a new decade now, just try to be gentle.
I can't tell you how to see me, just a case of bones, there's nothing inside.
The more I think about it, the more it amazes me just how much of a difference there has been in 10 years worth of video games. The games themselves rarely undergo any radical changes, since gaming hasn't departed too much from solve some problems, defeat the bad guy, and save the world and/or girl, but the entire climate surrounding how we consume video games has shifted drastically in such a short space of time. Streaming services like YouTube and Twitch mean that we can watch and laugh as someone struggles with a game and dies over and over again, and I'm not attributing Dark Souls' success entirely to the internet, but it definitely helped. Is it safe to say that Dark Souls made failure okay? Maybe not okay as such, but it's definitely a game set up with the knowledge that the average player will need some help to navigate hordes of ruthless enemies, and so has safeguards in place to ensure that any slips aren't punished too harshly. I remember my first time playing Dark Souls, and obviously I got destroyed because everyone did, but I didn't get as frustrated as I thought I would because of how fairly I felt I was treated. Future Soulsborne games have made some improvements in some key areas, but for my money, none of them have had level and enemy design as smart as this, or any impact on popular culture as great as the original Dark Souls. It's had 2 sequels, a spin-off, and a reimagining, I suppose, but Dark Souls' influence is so widespread that in fact every game is secretly related to it somehow. It's like the Genghis Khan of video games.
How to see me, just a case of bones, there's nothing inside.
The 2010s was the decade where indie games came to party. The previous decade had the likes of Cave Story and Braid, so it's not like we've suddenly got a whole load of indie games, but there was a huge explosion of small groups of people taking it upon themselves to make the video games they wanted to play. I haven't got the time or the space to talk about even a small fraction of them, so for now I'm just gonna talk about Undertale. I'm never going to be reminded of the relentless ravages of time more than by remembering that it's been 5 years this September since Undertale came out. Oh my god, that feels like yesterday, holy shit. The internet practically shut down for a few months as Undertale became this dominant cultural force that may have outstayed its welcome among some people, but it was hardly undeserving of all the praise it got. It's not like overbearing fans and creepy fan art suddenly voids all the positive things that Undertale did right, and I can overlook a lot of things if it means that I get to enjoy unique features like bullet hell RPG gameplay and some tight as fuck writing. That many people can't be completely wrong, surely. Undertale was the sort of self-confidence that I really wish more games had. It can put you in a room with a sentient skeleton and abruptly launch you into a small mini-game where you date the fucking thing, and he has spaghetti on his head, and yet none of it feels all that weird because of all the long dogs and depressed ghosts and angry training dummies that came before it. Or how about throwing you into a battle against some vegetables where you can forego fighting them and instead pacify them using your words and actions? It's a supremely smart game that's always a few steps ahead of you and always offering a new surprise just around the corner. Toby Fox has had an incredible time these past few years. Can't wait to see what's next.
Had to see me, just a geisha once. There's nothing inside.
This has comfortably been the decade of open world video games. Yeah, you can say that attention has shifted to other genres like battle royales, but even those draw a fair deal of inspiration from a large explorable overworld with details hidden around every corner. Not every open world game understood the best way of using the space, and I definitely start to get sick of games that were large just for the sake of it, often to their detriment, but after all this time I still have a lot of time for the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. This might be strange to hear, but there was a point in time when Bethesda were able to make games with a degree of competency without half the game folding in on itself in an orgy of glitches and exploits, and sometimes nukes. In fact, you'd have to say that Skyrim stands out amongst Bethesda's colourful catalogue of games as their best contribution to society. Back when they sort of knew what they were doing. Don't get me wrong, Skyrim is still glitchy as fuck, but in a more charming way, I suppose. It's not exactly a sign of a game performing as intended, but tumbling down the highest mountain covered in ice as your dead body starts spinning faster and faster is one of the most indelible images of the decade, and I'm not sorry about it. Skyrim was a little rough around the edges in places, but it's relatively perfect by Bethesda's recent standards, and that's before you get to the actually great things like the world design that encourages a sense of adventure that feeds very well into the sheer number of things you can do in this game. Obviously it's been surpassed by other open world games, and I'd be a fool to try to convince you that Skyrim was the origin point for this genre of games, but it definitely felt like the start of the general public getting involved with large overworlds, and I think the sales figures reflect that. There's a reason why it's been re-released 87 times.
Had to see me, just a geisha once. There's nothing inside.
I haven't been making best game of the year videos every year since I started this channel. I think my first year was 2015, where I brought them in because I felt like I needed a video that looked back on the year with some fondness and summarized how the year went as a whole. At the same time, I don't think the #1 slot in all of those videos are automatic picks for this video, since I've had time to think about a lot of those, and other games have had time to expand their reaches so that they're more equivalent to cultural phenomenons than video games now. How else would you even begin to describe what Smash Bros. Ultimate has become? I'm not even sure Nintendo know what Ultimate has turned into. There was clearly a plan in place from very early in development to include every previous character in what is easily the biggest roster in the franchise, but even then, it's incredible to see where Smash Bros. Ultimate has gone with the Fighters Pass DLC. With additions like Joker and Terry alongside previous headline makers like Cloud and Ryu, Smash Bros. Is no longer a celebration of the best characters that Nintendo has to offer. This now extends to so many different franchises and so many different periods of gaming history that it feels like a grand festival of everything gaming. I used to think that Nintendo had rules for what characters couldn't be in Smash Bros, but I'm fairly convinced now that everything is on the table. Never mind that the game is really good and tight and getting balances all over the place, and sometimes characters are overpowered but then they get nerfed, and it's a good game, but we're also getting 6 more fighters very soon, and I for one am not prepared for what may come next. Travis Touchdown seems like a good idea.
Had to see me, just a geisha once. There's nothing inside.
Dark Souls set ablaze a fire that roared across the world. Suddenly, the demand for challenging games that beat you into the ground in a moment's notice shot through the roof as players everywhere succumbed to their natural masochistic tendencies. Dark Souls perfected its art to such a degree that every game under the sun has the same energy and excitement surrounding just how difficult it could be, since maybe I could recycle my Dark Souls skills in a completely different setting and feel the satisfaction flow through me. If you're wondering if this is a sign of taking games too seriously, relax. I'm really happy that I finally beat that B-boss in Cuphead. I just don't know how to adequately express myself. Not that difficulty was the only thing that Cuphead had going for it, since I reckon the vast majority of you have eyes and can recognise one of the single best art styles of the last decade. Bit of a walkover really, since you're simply not beating hand-drawn animations with so much life and character put into every frame of a game that runs at 60 frames per second, and the inspiration to take ideas and surreal concepts from 1930s cartoons proved to be one of Cuphead's greatest ideas. After seeing a trailer for it in 2014, I was left wondering how this would all come together all the way up until 2017 when, after numerous delays and houses being remortgaged to pay for it, Cuphead was every bit the game it should have been. Since then, Cuphead has sold a ton of copies, won awards for its greatness, and even squeezed its way into Smash Bros somehow. Sometimes all that pain is worth it in the end.
You had to see me just a geisha once. There's nothing inside.
Stories have gotten really good now. There are a few standout examples of killer storytelling from the previous decade, and it's not like writers have suddenly realised how to make video game plotlines interesting, but gaming from all narratives, rich and indie alike, have gone in hard on those engaging narratives. You have no idea how much I wanted to put Spec Ops: For Lion on here, but I didn't want to play into my own stereotype, and besides, the actual game portion isn't all that great, even though the story is incredible. I'm not sure if any one game inspired this storytelling renaissance, but I look back at 2013's The Last of Us and think, yeah, that sure was a good story. It had zombies and violence and dead rabbits, which all helped to contribute to a complex story that doesn't necessarily end in a satisfying way. But hey, it's a zombie apocalypse. What were the odds of that happening? There's a few different angles of approaching The Last of Us. You can view it as a fairly standard zombie action third-person survival-y game where, there's a few mechanics thrown around to make things interesting, and there's not a lot wrong with that. But the preferred angle is one of looking at the narrative and the story and how engaging it is and how it ebbs and flows so violently it'll probably make you sick. It's up to you really. The Last of Us definitely has a video game under its richly detailed story, and it'd be a crime to ignore it, but it'd be an even bigger crime to pretend that the writing and the voice acting performances and the general presentation of the story isn't head and shoulders above everything else the industry has to offer. The first time I played through The Last of Us, I kinda let everything wash over me, since I was concentrating on the gameplay rather than how it contextualizes every other feature of the game, and yes, if you take the story away, then there are a few too many holes to ignore. There have been games in the past 10 years where I can close my eyes and remember the fun I had playing, but The Last of Us is heavily rooted in the memories I made watching some truly incredible events unfold because of what I did in the gameplay portions. In truth, I've been all over the place with this game, first saying it's overrated, then saying it's good but Joel is a psychopath, but now I'm fully on board with everything that The Last of Us does. If you ask me, I would have preferred it if it didn't have a sequel, since the ending is kinda perfect as is, but I'm very intrigued where they're going with these characters in this storyline. I'm expecting some dope shit, Naughty Dog.
You had to see me just a geisha once. There's nothing inside.
Kickstarter has hung over most of this past decade like a malicious spectre. I get the point of it, and not everyone who uses it does so with mischievous intent, but the fear of funding a game that turns out to be utter garbage has become all too real in recent times. I haven't helped to fund too many games, in part because of this concern, but if there was ever a game that I wished that I was a part of, it would have to be Shovel Knight. It's annoying since I first heard of it once it had flown through its Kickstarter campaign and was already looking very promising as a beautiful homage to classic video games like Mega Man and Zelda 2. Not that you can read too much into that, because I'm sure there was a point where Mighty No. 9 looked exciting before a big dollop of reality got dumped all over it. Shovel Knight didn't have to be good, but the fact that it was, and then some, meant that every Kickstarter game after it suddenly had a reputation to keep up. So, thanks for that. Shovel Knight is some of the best, purest gaming you can get these days. No fuss, no messing around, even the DLC is just more video game by means of an expansion instead of anything shady. You can sit down and play this game on a huge variety of different systems and let its hard but fair style of gameplay wash all over you. The learning curve is so gradual and it reaches so high that you feel perfectly equipped to take on other challenges in the game, like destroying every checkpoint for more treasure. The most impressive thing is that Shovel Knight never rests on its laurels and never relies on nostalgia to get people in the door. Instead, it always has something to say or has new content to throw at you, with each level having an idea or gimmick that completely changes how you approach the level. Or you can dip a toe into the DLC and play as Plague Knight, Spectre Knight or King Knight in brand new stories and levels. There's so much game here that I actually don't know what to do with it all. Kickstarter never stood a chance.
Had to see me, just a case of bones. There's nothing inside.
It's hard to say which developer won the 2010s, if just because that's a fairly lengthy period of time and 10 years of consistent success is very hard to come by. My money would probably be on someone like Rockstar, who didn't release a ton of games, but the very few they did release made them a ton of money and got them huge critical acclaim, and like any of them could have been here. You know how hard it's to choose between like 3 incredible games for this list? It's a tough job. There's some enjoyable symmetry with how Rockstar started and kind of ended this decade. Feels like forever since Red Dead Redemption came out, but it did squeeze its way into the 2010s by virtue of being released halfway through 2010. And yet despite this, it really doesn't feel like a 10-year-old video game. 2018 saw the sequel released, and while it makes a lot of technical improvements with graphics that look better than real life, I don't think it quite holds up as well as the first Red Dead Redemption. The sequel feels segmented into story content and general exploration of the world, whereas RDR1 is just wild and west. And also really fucking good, but I like to think that that's a given this far into the video. Before 2010, you'd happily say that Rockstar have a penchant for open world design and an eye for detail that can carry them through these gigantic environments, but Red Dead Redemption is where they announce themselves as kings of outstanding storytelling. John Marston became one of the most iconic characters of the decade despite only appearing in one game, because he was written to be this wonderful, multi-dimensional personality who struggles with moral ambiguity, and his constant search for forgiveness gives him a vulnerability that was somewhat lacking from previous Rockstar protagonists. And hey, I do like RDR2, especially for its unbelievably well written story, but the first game was always likely to be lightning in a bottle and very hard to replicate. Like The Last of Us, I would have been happy if we never got a sequel because that ending is, oh, it's so good. But I'm hardly going to kick RDR2 out of bed for trying. You'll never play anything quite like it again.
Had to see me, just a case of bones. There's nothing inside.
Red Dead Redemption is all well and good, but you and I know that it isn't Rockstar's star of the show. Certainly both RDR games have moments to them that transcend their status as big releases, but no matter how excited people were for these games, the anticipation for each and every Grand Theft Auto game is always going to be bigger. And you can see why, since Rockstar went huge for GTA 5, making additions and refinements across the board, and somehow making massive expansions on what is already one of the biggest and boldest franchises out there. When Grand Theft Auto 5 came out, it was met with the usual combination of controversy at certain parts of it and mass hysteria that manifests itself as queues reaching out of the store and miles down the road. If ever there was the quintessential GTA experience. The amount of work that went into this game genuinely astounds me at times. Rockstar's attempt to capture a slice of suburban life have resulted in more detail than any Rockstar game before or since, and the options you have at your disposal for what you can spend your time on is genuinely a little staggering. The decision to shift the tone from the brown seriousness of GTA 4 to the bright and colourful playfulness of Los Santos in 2013 worked wonders for the overall feel of this game, and in general, having a world this detailed with so much life in it is one of the greatest technical achievements in gaming history for the Xbox 360 and PS3. Strange to think then that this game is 7 years old and is still getting updates through GTA Online and is still one of the most popular games on YouTube and Twitch. Rockstar will one day make GTA 6 because of course they will, but you look at some of the records that GTA 5 set and you wonder how they could ever be topped. Save a space in your diaries for another circuit on the GTA roller coaster.
Had to see me, just a case of bones. There's nothing inside.
It says a lot about the strength of the last 10 years of video games that there's no one standout choice for the best game of the decade. At least to me there isn't. All of you out there have your favourites and probably 1 or 2 games that immediately come to mind when you think about this topic, but as I've stated before, it's an impossible choice. I know what my first thought was when starting out with this video. I'm just wondering if anyone is likely to agree with me. When I think of the one game I was the most excited for and the one game that had the most riding on it and yet came through with flying colours under some incredibly intense pressure, I can't help but come back to Breath of the Wild. I put so many hours into this game that it isn't even funny. Zelda has always been about that scope for adventure, being able to leave that central area and walk in one single direction until you can't go any further. But things have definitely slowed down recently as Nintendo has begun to focus on more linear adventures. Breath of the Wild was the shot to the arm this franchise dearly needed that harkens back to the concepts found in the first Zelda game way back in 1986, with its truly open world that you can explore to your heart's content. The options you have for exploration as well as combat and puzzle solving make this one of the most exciting adventure games ever made. And when you consider the pressure this game was under to succeed, not just within its own franchise amongst a few barren years with very little news and mediocre releases, but looking at the bigger picture and the fact that Breath of the Wild was a release game for the Switch and easily the most appealing game at launch, it simply had to be good. The fact that it was one of the best games of the decade and helped to springboard the Switch into tens of millions of sales, I mean, what more could you ask for? Except for actual dungeons and a human form for Ganondorf in the sequel, please. I think that's fair. This RabbidLuigi and Breath of the Wild is the ultimate encouraging sign for any franchise that it can always return to what made it incredible in the first place. Zelda games weren't terrible in the 2010s, but they were starting to veer away from what made them classics in the first place. Breath of the Wild is a sign that you can always return to your roots and really get more out of it than you ever did originally, and I hope developers were paying attention, because I could do with Silent Hill being good again.